They said the frontier was a land for the bold, the strong, and the beautiful. But sometimes, legends began with those who had none of those things, at least, not in the way the world measured them. The sun bled over the rooftops of Dry Creek, a town baked into the desert spine like an old scar. Dust rose with every wagon wheel and bootstep, hanging heavy in the air, and the wooden porches creaked under the weight of gossip and judgment. Folks here didn't keep secrets for long. The prairie wind carried every whisper. And that morning, all whispers turned toward a woman standing in the street with a suitcase too heavy for her narrow arms. Clarabelle looked plain in a way the world didn't forgive. Her dress, though clean, clung awkwardly to her frame. Her hair, the color of straw that had sat too long in the sun, never seemed to shine. Her face bore no softness, no sparkle, only the angles of someone worn thin by years of hunger and hard living. When she stepped off the coach weeks earlier, men who had sent for wives turned away. The banker's boy, who'd written her the letters, squinted once at her and muttered something sharp under his breath before he paid the driver extra to take her further on. Since then, Clara had drifted through town like a ghost, surviving off whatever work she could claw at, scrubbing floors for pennies, mending torn shirts for ranch hands who laughed at her even as they handed over their wages. That morning she walked past the mercantile, carrying a sack of stale bread she'd traded cleaning for. A cluster of women stood outside, skirts fanning in the heat, hands busy with gossip as sharp as any knife. "Mail-order bride, is she?" One of them whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Bride," another scoffed. "More like a burden. No man here'd take her even if she came free with the land." Their laughter was thin and cruel, like coyotes yipping at night. Clara lowered her gaze and gripped the sack tighter, her knuckles pale against the rough cloth. She had learned not to answer back. Words wasted breath, and every retort only earned her louder jeers. Better to keep moving, even if every step felt heavier than the last. The prairie beyond town offered little comfort, flat stretches of dust where the sun burned without mercy, broken only by patches of brittle grass and the occasional twisting mesquite. Yet Clara preferred the silence of the open land to the mouths of townsfolk. Out there, no one told her she was worthless. Out there, she was simply another speck against the horizon. But even the wilderness did not wash away the sting. At night she lay on the cot of the boarding house, listening to boots stomping past her door, laughter drifting up from the saloon, and she pressed her hands together as if praying. She had come west believing she might find a place, even love. Instead, she had found only a sharper edge of loneliness. Still, she endured. That was the only gift life had given her, an ability to keep standing when the world wanted her to kneel. It was during one of those long afternoons, when the town seemed to simmer in the heat and tempers flared as quickly as matches, that she first noticed him. Elias Kane rode in slow from the southern trail, his horse lathered with sweat and his hat pulled low. Folks parted when he passed, not out of respect, but wariness. His name carried weight in Dry Creek, though most whispered it with unease. Some said he'd fought in the war and carried the ghosts of men he'd killed. Others claimed his ranch, a lonely sprawl at the base of the canyon, had gone up in flames years back, leaving him scarred in body and spirit. He rarely came into town, and when he did, men nodded without meeting his eyes, while women clutched their children closer. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his boots hitting the boards with a thud. That was when the cruelest of the cowhands chose his moment. Clara had been sweeping outside the boarding house, her hair damp with sweat, when the men from the livery strode past. One of them, a tall brute with sun-cracked lips, snatched the broom from her hands and twirled it like a rifle. "Careful now, boys," he called out. "Don't let her hex you. Plain as a fence post, but I swear she'll curse any man who looks her way too long." The others barked with laughter. Another tossed her sack of bread into the dust, stomping it flat beneath his heel. Clara's face burned, but she bent quietly to gather the crumbs. Every time she thought she had learned how to endure, they found a new way to strip another layer of dignity. It was then she felt it, the weight of someone watching. She looked up, brushing strands of hair from her damp forehead, and saw Elias Kane leaning against the hitch rail. His face bore the kind of scars that made people flinch without meaning to, jagged lines pulling at the corner of his mouth, one cheek seared into rough ridges, his skin darkened in uneven patches from fire's kiss. But his eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, were steady, not cruel, not mocking. The cowhands turned to the silence that settled. One muttered something about burnt cane and spat, but the scarred rancher didn't answer. He only looked at Clara a long while, until the men shifted uncomfortably and drifted off. Clara's breath trembled as she clutched the ruined sack. She waited for the pity to come, the kind she hated most, because it reminded her of her place. But Elias did not move toward her, did not speak soft words or offer a handkerchief. He only gave the faintest nod, as if he recognized something in her, something more than what the others saw. She held that look longer than she meant to, until he pushed away from the rail, swung into his saddle, and rode off toward the horizon where the canyon split the land in two. When the dust from his horse settled, Clara found herself still kneeling in the street, crumbs in her hand, heart thundering with something she had not felt in years. Not love, not hope, something quieter, but stronger. A sense that perhaps someone else in this world understood what it meant to live scarred. And for the first time since she had stepped off that coach, Clara did not feel entirely invisible. The next morning, Clara rose with the sun and found her way to the edge of town where the prairie rolled into Elias Kane's land. His ranch was quiet but weathered, the fences in need of mending, the barn roof patched with whatever wood he could scavenge. Chickens scattered at her approach, pecking at the dirt as if daring her to take charge. She had not been asked outright to come, but something in the man's steady gaze the day before had planted the thought. Perhaps he would need hands. Perhaps he would not send her away. When Elias appeared from the barn, wiping dust from his scarred hands with a rag, she expected him to question why she was there. Instead, he looked her over once and said, "Chickens need feeding, Dot." His voice was low, gravelly from years of smoke and silence, yet it carried no cruelty. She nodded and began, and just like that, the pattern of her days shifted. Clara learned quickly how to move about the place. She mended torn shirts that smelled of smoke and horse, patched saddle straps, hauled buckets from the well until her shoulders ached. Elias worked beside her without much talk, and at first their silence seemed as vast as the land itself. But silence could carry its own kind of companionship. When she faltered with a fence post, his hand steadied it without a word. When she burned her palms hauling water, he left a small tin of sal by the door, no explanation given. It was in the stables that Clara began to understand him better. One of the horses, a chestnut mare with a torn flank, shied away from anyone who drew near. Clara crouched low, whispering softly, and extended her hand. The horse trembled, but did not bolt. She stayed like that for a long while, her breath even, her presence calm, until the animal finally lowered its head and pressed its nose against her palm. Elias, standing in the shadows of the stall, watched her with something almost like wonder. "She's mean when she hurts," he said at last. "We all are," Clara answered. Their eyes met, and in that unguarded moment something shifted, not with thunder or fireworks, but like a door quietly opening. As summer wore on, whispers drifted through town of outlaws raiding ranches to the north, leaving smoke and blood in their wake. They were said to be ruthless men, led by a gunman whose reputation carried as much fear as Elias's once had. At the saloon, men muttered of stolen horses, women whispered of homes burned to ash. Dry Creek was small, poor, and vulnerable. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before trouble rolled their way. One evening, Clara found Elias sitting on the porch, his rifle across his knees though the barrel bore dust from disuse. The sky above them bled red into violet, coyotes howling in the distance. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap, the air between them heavy with things unspoken. "You used to fight," she said quietly, not as a question but a truth she could feel. His jaw worked before he answered. "I did." She waited. Silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of prairie grass in the wind. Finally, he went on. "Wasn't always a rancher. Rode with men once, carried a name feared more and loved. Could draw faster than most, shoot straighter than the law itself. Folks called me Kane's hand, said I was born to deal judgment. But fire don't care what name you wear. Took my house, near took my life. Left me with this." He touched the scarred side of his face, the skin puckered and rough. Clara's breath caught. She had known pain, but his words carried the weight of something deeper, violence, regret, a man who had tried to bury himself along with his past. She wanted to reach out, to touch the mark that frightened others away, but her hand stayed still in her lap. "They say scars show weakness," she murmured. "I think they show survival." His gaze flicked to hers, sharp and searching, as though he had not expected such words from her. In the quiet that followed, a bond settled deeper between them, not spoken, but felt. Days bled into weeks, and their work bound them closer. She laughed once, soft, surprised, when a goat nipped at her skirt, and Elias turned his head sharply at the sound, as though he hadn't heard laughter in years. He found himself leaving small tasks for her to finish, watching her patience with animals that trusted no one else, seeing the way her shoulders straightened even under the weight of ridicule. He realized she carried scars as surely as he did, though hers were hidden beneath plain features and the cruel judgment of others. One night, thunderheads built on the horizon, lightning tearing open the sky. Clara rushed to the barn to calm the horses, finding the chestnut mare thrashing in panic. Elias followed, and together they pressed close to the animal, his hands on the reins, hers stroking the trembling flank. Rain hammered the roof, wind shrieked through the cracks, but between them, horse and humans alike steadied. When at last the storm passed, they leaned against the stall, damp and exhausted, their shoulders brushing. Neither moved away. In the days that followed, Clara began to see Elias not as the men townsfolk feared, but as a fortress weathered by fire, standing strong against the storm. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He treated her not as fragile, not as pitiful, but as someone whose hands mattered, whose presence made the ranch whole. And Elias, for his part, found himself watching her when she did not know it. How her hair, though plain, caught gold in the evening sun, how her eyes softened when she tended the wounded, how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite all the world's cruelty. He began to feel something dangerous, something he thought long dead. Respect first, then warmth, then something more, though he dared not name it. Rumors of the outlaw gang grew louder, shadows lengthening across the land. But in that fragile space between fear and survival, Elias Kane and Clara Bell discovered in each other what no one else had cared to see. Two scarred souls, standing stronger together than apart. And though neither spoke of it aloud, both began to wonder if, in a land that swallowed the weak and exalted only the strong, they had found something far rarer than beauty or reputation. They had found each other. They came in with the dawn, 6 riders wide across the eastern ridge, their silhouettes black against a sullen sky. By the time the sun cleared the mesas, smoke already curled from the Harris Ranch, thin at first, then thick, and the wind carried the smell of scorched wood into Dry Creek as if to remind everyone what lawlessness tastes like. Horse hooves drummed the earth, a beat too steady for cattle or mail coaches, and people began to close shutters that never stayed closed when fear was in town. By noon the outlaws were everywhere, at the livery demanding fresh stock, at the mercantile scooping flour and coffee with their bare hands, in the alley behind the saloon smashing whiskey bottles for the pleasure of the sound. One old farmer tried to bar them from his wagon. They knocked him down and rolled the wheels over his pride. Another man reached for a pitchfork and was left groaning in the dust, not dead, but humiliated enough to wish he could disappear. At the edge of it all stood the sheriff, a man who wore a tin star like it had been pinned to him by mistake. He hovered in the doorway of his office, eyes darting, thumb rubbing the metal smooth. When a woman begged him to step in, he whispered that he was waiting for a better moment. Better moments are rare in the West. Worse ones arrive on schedule. Names floated on the heat. Ashriker, the one with the gray coat and snake grin. His brother Deacon, broad as a barn door. 3 others with road dust faces and eyes like bathtub wells. And a boy with peach fuzz who laughed too eagerly, as if terror were a joke that finally included him. They were a moving wound across the town, and every door they passed left another mark. By mid-afternoon, the whispers started. Folks leaned toward each other like reeds in a dry river. Voices dropped to the hush of prayer. Elias Kane. Kane's hand. He's out there. He won't come. He will if he must. The sheriff heard those murmurs and looked toward the south, toward the lonely rise of land where a barn roof peeled in the wind and a porch sagged under years of solitude. He didn't step in that direction. He shut his door and locked it, and the sound of the bolt sliding home was louder than any sermon. On the high ground, Clara and Elias saw the smoke too, a dark banner that shifted the afternoon light to a sallow bruise. Elias mended a saddle with careful fingers, his scars tight and pale in the streaks of sun that cut through the barn boards. Clara stood by the chestnut mare, rubbing a salve into the healing welt along the flank, murmuring nonsense to keep the animals breathing slow. The quiet between them wasn't emptiness. It had become something like trust's first language. They'll come through town, she said finally. Likely, he answered. She looked at him as if trying to read a map across his silence. Will you stop them? He didn't raise his eyes. Not my river to dam anymore. You damned worse, she said, soft, not a challenge but a truth. And the water still remembers. He set the saddle aside and leaned back on his heels. I swore off drawing for other folks' fear. I have my place, and I keep it." He hesitated, then added in a tone that tried to be iron and came out weary, "So long as they keep for mine." The day hung there, balanced on a decision he wouldn't make aloud. Clara turned back to the mare, finished her work, and wiped her hands on her skirt. "They'll head to the saloon," she said. "Everything bad comes to a seat there." A humorless smile touched her mouth. "I'll go fetch flour before they take it all." "Wait till morning," he said. "There won't be anything left by morning," she replied, and he knew she was right. She walked into town with her shoulders set, her steps unhurried as if facing the wind rather than a storm with names. The street was half deserted, the other half pretending to watch something else. She slipped into the mercantile, bartered quiet, and emerged with a small sack hugged to her chest. She'd nearly made it to the boarding house when the boy outlaw, the eager one, stepped into her path, all grin and swagger that fit him like his brother's coat. "Well now," he crowed, loud enough to summon the others, "here's the bride nobody wanted." He plucked the sack from her arms and tossed it behind him. Flour burst against the dirt like a pale gunshot. Clara didn't flinch. She looked past him to Riker himself, who lounged at the saloon doors with a toothpick moving back and forth, as calm as a cat before the bird realizes it's cornered. "Bring her in," Riker said, bored, like ordering another round. "Let the ladies see how men pass a pleasant afternoon." Hands grabbed Clara's arms. She staggered but didn't stumble as they hauled her across the boards and through the doors that swung and squealed on rusted hinges. Inside, heat and stale whiskey wrapped the air. The piano, unattended, wore a film of dust. Riker's men made a show of bowing as they steered her to the center of the room. Someone slid a chair away with a scrape that made teeth ache. They wanted a spectacle. Humiliation tastes sweetest when shared. "Dance for us," the boy said, too high on cruelty to hear his own voice shake. "Or recite your wedding vows. We'll be your congregation." Clara lifted her chin. The room blurred at the edges the way it does when blood rages to the surface, but her eyes were clear. She had been mocked in a dozen ways by better-dressed men. Shame cuts deep only when you believe the blade is honest. These blades were nothing but junk iron. "I won't dance for boys," she said, voice even. "And I won't speak vows to men who never kept a promise to themselves." The boy's grin faltered. Deacon Riker laughed a heavy, mean laugh and shoved Clara's shoulder hard enough to make the chair behind her topple. She caught herself, straightened, and smoothed her skirt with deliberate hands. She would not give them what they wanted. She would not cry. Outside, a wind rose, pushing grit against the window panes until they sang. The saloon doors creaked again. No one had heard hoofbeats. No one had seen him cross the street. But he was there suddenly, as if the legend had unfolded from the shadow between seconds. Elias Kane stepped in, head brimlow, coat hanging straight, the scarred side of his face turned unashamed to the room. He didn't fill the doorway with sighs. He filled it with silence, the kind that makes talkers forget their lines. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. A fly in the amber of lamplight, a bead of sweat traveling the boy's temple, the dust motes hanging like lazy stars. Riker's toothpick stilled. "Afternoon," Elias said to the room, to the years, to the men he used to be. Riker's smile returned slowly, beast-showing teeth. "Now ain't that a ghost?" he drawled. "Kane's hand, I reckon. Thought the fire cooked you down to ash." "Looks like it missed," Elias answered. "Turn around," Deacon growled, swinging his arm toward the door. "This ain't your problem, Kane." Elias's gaze slid to Clara. He took in the flour on her skirt, the red marks on her arms, the stubborn set of her mouth. Something in him, something he'd buried under work and weather, rose like a spark landing in dry brush. "It is now," he said. The boy laughed a little too loud. "You gonna preach or play?" He moved his hand toward his holster with a flourish he'd practiced in front of a mirror. Elias didn't look at him. He moved forward, slow enough to give anyone with sense a chance to leave. No one moved. He walked until he stood beside Clara, not between her and danger but with her in the line of it. She felt the heat of him, heard the calm in his breathing. He reached gently, palm up, and she placed her hand in his for a moment, not seeking rescue, but offering something older than fear. When he let go, the room exhaled like a bellows before a forge roars. "Out," Elias told the others. "Take what you stole and go. Don't come back." Riker's smile dropped. "You think you can tell the wind where to blow?" He flicked his eyes toward the boy. "Show him we don't take sermons.